I'm pressing, and then Cecilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And of course, my first words to you are a big warm welcome to this last session in the seminar series with the Posthumanities Hub. But it's not only the last session, it's actually also a seminar that is the launch and start of something new. So this seminar has the theme Arts of Non/Living Matters. And my name is Cecilia Åsberg. I'm professor at Linköping University. And I would like to take the opportunity to remind you all again that this session will be recorded for posterity. And as I mentioned, my friends, this is not just the last session, the last seminar with the Posthumanities Hub. It's also our grande finale and the launching of the new research group. So I am particularly proud and happy to present to you today as the founder and director of the Posthumanities Hub since 2008. So it's really my pride to welcome you to the launch of the new research group, the Eco and Bioart Lab. The Eco and Bioart Lab is headed by Dr. Marietta Radomska and is a mushrooming strand of the kind of transformative academic mycelium that is the Posthumanities Hub. And Marietta has been one of the postdocs with the Posthumanities Hub, and she has been for a few years now also been the co-director of the Posthumanities Hub. You have all encountered her in various social media settings. And now she is to launch and lead her own research group at Linköping University. But of course, she will continue. So don't be scared. She won't abandon us. She will continue with us in the Posthumanities Hub as well. And the Posthumanities Hub is this extra-disciplinary and collaborative multi-university and multi-community with joint seminars. And we will also have many exciting activities that we will actually launch in the fall. For instance, together with the EBL, that abbreviation that you now need to learn, the Eco and Bioart Lab. Without further ado, I would like to briefly present to you the two speakers today. We have, hailing from Finland, Aalto University, a truly transdisciplinary practitioner, Margherita Pevere, who works across bioart and performance with a visceral signature. Her arresting creations hunt today's surging ecological complexity and the ways embodiment and environment are always entangled. To do so, her research hybridizes biolab practice, ecology, queer and deaf studies with a hacking attitude. She has exhibited her work internationally and is now completing a PhD in artistic research at Aalto University on bioart and queer theory. It's also my great pleasure to introduce to you very briefly the multi-talented Margherita Radomska. Margherita Radomska is an assistant professor in environmental humanities at Linköping University. She's also now the director of the Eco and Bioart Lab, and of course still a co-director with the Posthumanities Hub and co-founder of Queer Deaf Studies Network. She works at the intersection of the posthumanities, environmental humanities, continental philosophy, feminist theory, queer deaf studies, visual culture, and contemporary art. And she has published extensively, for instance, in Australian feminist studies, somotechnics, women gender research, and art nodes, amongst many other places. It is my great pleasure to be the chair of this event. So the day or the few moments we have together looks like this, that Margherita Radomska will give you a little bit of an introduction to the EBL, the Eco and Bioart Research Lab. Then Margherita Margherita will talk a little bit, and then Marietta will talk a little bit. And after that, we will have a little bit of a leg stretcher, the famous comfort break. And of course, there will be room for, as we call it, burning questions after each of the presentations. But after the two talks and after the leg stretcher, we will also have a bigger Q&A. So please present your questions or comments or in the chat, and we will try to make sure that we get to all of your questions. So without further ado, I give the floor to the new director of the Eco and Bioart Lab, Marietta Radomska.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. I mean, that was very, I would say, overly generous introduction. Okay, so I will try to, speak very briefly. So maybe, if you are wondering what actually this research group is about, I think that, those of you who have been following us, at least for the past half a year, have a little bit of a flavor that we have some sort of artish kind of, bent to our conversations this semester. And in fact, the semester has been quite, I would say, engaged in thinking with arts, thinking with sort of, the kind of also visionary and critical creative potentials of arts. So, I mean, as you also know, my kind of grounding or my own work is very much related to bioart, so the type of art that is really sort of engaged with both biological matter and probably scientific methods and protocols, and kind of practice, but also with various forms of art that intersect with the environment. So this is our official banner, which you will probably see. Our website is being launched by LiU, so by Linköping University, and we are still waiting. Unfortunately, it didn't happen until today. But the Eco and Bioart Lab basically connects artists, artistic researchers, but also other practitioners, and of course, doctoral students who are here in the room, which, I'm very proud of being able to collaborate with them. So that's absolutely fantastic. Whose practice and research focus on art and the environment in their kind of broadest understanding. So we aim to actually create this transdisciplinary space where artistic practice and artistic research, of course, converge with, more kind of theoretical perspectives. So with philosophy, with cultural theory, with performance studies, art studies, visual culture, queer deaf studies, environmental humanities and post-humanities, but really in synergy and, as equally legitimate voices and equally legitimate practices. And EBL also tries to address critical questions concerned with life, death, nature, culture, art, science, ecology, environment, vulnerability, materiality, and the body in a modern human sense. And I think that, a lot of those themes will reemerge also during the talks today. So in that sense, also, we look at transdisciplinary practices of bioart and art science, but also, at environmental, ecological, and other forms of contemporary art that explore entanglements and relationalities between the human and the modern human. So in that sense, we could say that we really, this space, EBL, aims to zoom in on art practice, artistic research, as well as art-focused research, as transdisciplinary critical creative modes of catalyzing different new knowledges, understandings, narratives, sensibilities, and imaginaries. And we really aim to both generate and really nurture transversal dialogues focused on the ways in which contemporary art mobilizes innovative approaches to modern human ecologies, relations, environments, and futures. And I think I can, stop sharing my screen right now. But I wanted to say perhaps, just as a way of proceeding to the talks today, that the theme arts of non-living matters, I mean, of course, directs you a bit towards the question of, art and perhaps life, perhaps environment, perhaps life-death boundary. Also towards materiality, towards vulnerability. And I think if this is your intuition, what you might expect today, I mean, the intuition is right and correct. And of course, this session is very much embedded in, in the kind of previous collaborations between Margherita and myself, our kind of joint work and dialogue, but also in Margherita's work really with the non/living. And I mean, if you read the blurb about this session, I mean, of course, then you kind of sort of know more or less what the non/living is. Neither living nor non-living, but something in between. And also the session really kind of links back to the previous Posthumanities Hub seminar focused on queer deaf aesthetics. It is also embedded both in this very kind of, environmental art, eco art, bioart research, but on the other hand, is also very much embedded in the kind of, queering approaches to the inquiries related to death, dying, and mourning in a kind of more than human sense, particularly coming to the fore in I think both Margherita's and my own work. So I think that I was a bit faster than I thought, but maybe that's good. And without adding anything else, I would just pass the baton to Margherita. So the floor is yours, my dear.
Thank you. And perhaps before I start my presentation, I would like to ask if there are questions before I continue. Otherwise, I will start. Okay. So it's a huge pleasure to be here today. I'm very thankful to Marietta for inviting me to the presentation, but also for the work which she has done, bridging philosophical inquiry and bioart practice to the Posthumanities Hub and now with the EBL. And I thank you, Cecilia, for the nice introduction and everyone who's attending the panel. It's great to be here. Before I talk about my work, I would like to tell you about a leak that happened this morning. So here comes my slideshow. 1 second, so I make sure this, share, and start. Do you see my screen now?
We still see the editor's view, my dear.
Then 1 second.
Okay, now.
Do you see now?
There was a moment, but now it's again editor's view. And we were testing that before, by the way. That's the message to the audience.
Yeah, we were, of course, we tested it. So
the usual
share. What about this?
Now we see the full screen.
Okay,
that's perfect.
Great. So we are on the right place. Fantastic. Because this morning I had to travel a bit to come to this place from where I'm doing the presentation, because I'm traveling to Italy, the place where I come from, on the North Adriatic coast. And there was a huge leak. There was something unexpected, something that exceeded my plan, because there was 1.5 hour delay on the railway station. So I was staying at a place where there is not a reliable internet connection, which, as an international artist, academic, pisses you off. But then it also reminds you that not everywhere everything is as reliable as you think it should be or works the same way. So I decided to go to that small village, to a nearby city by train, to be sustainable. But there was a railway delay, 70 minutes, so I panicked. But it was interesting because it allowed me to reflect on how I incorporate the ecological observation that I practiced in these two places that I know very well into the work that I do today. In fact, the small village I'm staying is on a lagoon. A lagoon is a liminal place, it's a liminal area. It's neither sea nor land. The salt water mixes with salty water. So the fresh water mixes with salty water. There are pioneer plants. There are tidal areas that sometimes are uncovered, sometimes are covered by air, by water. And it's a place of extraordinary beauty and silence and fantastic smells. And I remember when I first understood why at the beginning of the winter, the water that usually is not crystalline, it doesn't look like beautiful according to standard parameters because you don't see the bottom in the summer, and that's because of bacteria and algal activity. Then in the winter, when the temperature drops, this microbial activity stops and you see the bottom. And so I moved to the city this morning, which is a city on a rocky coast. So you have crystalline water, and it's a city of a stunning beauty. So I encourage you also to visit it. But this year, there has been two phenomena that are a bit uncanny. You have flocks of jellyfishes coming very close to the coast, and it's still unclear the reason for that. So many of them are stranded on the sea, on the beaches. You also have blooming of Noctiluca scintillans, which is a microorganism, the one that glows at night when when there are waves. And this is also unclear. The reason for that is yet unclear. Of course, researchers are working on that. It seems it's because of the warming, but it's not certain. However, these kind of observations are fundamental, have become fundamental tools in addressing the questions I ask myself in my works. This is me working in the biolab while I was preparing one of my recent bioart pieces, Wombs I worked. The picture was taken in Uri Institute in Croatia, a biohacking lab. So this to remind that we have institutional research lab, and then there is a myriad of research places between citizen science, biohacking, DIY science that contribute to the production of knowledge, although they are not institutionalized. I will show now a couple of artworks from the past years. They are installations, bioart pieces, and one performance. The first one is called Lymph, and it's an installation that was commissioned by a festival in Berlin, working on the festival theme was the sensation feelings, and I was assigned disgust. So I started researching on disgust versus objection, or better, disgust as a physiological reaction that is characterized by holding your breath, wrinkling your nose, or objection after Kristeva, the way she formulated that, the concept. And the work starts from the observation of how blood meal is debris. It's something that is discarded from industrial farming and is used nowadays as organic fertilizer. And it has, interestingly, it has the same color of caput mortuum pigment. Caput mortuum is the last remain in the alchemic process of sublimation. They have the same color, and they are both remain, the very last remain, the thing that is discarded. However, blood meal, whereas other components of animal bodies are used, I don't know, in cosmetics or in agroalimentary industry, it's used as fertilizer. But in the past years, it was also used as food for cattle, and this led to the diffusion of the crazy cow disease. And for this reason, because this product is associated with this disease, it's not sold everywhere because buyers don't buy it because of the association, although it does not provoke anything sold in dried form because it's powder. So you have a shelf with organic fertilizers and there is no blood meal everywhere. The installation is thought to evolve during the time of the exhibition through a dripping process that slowly covers the whole cloth. And then there is a vial which you can lift its lid and smell it. And of course, everyone who didn't have this had this objection, they had this disgust reaction. Whereas the narrative behind the piece observes objection in its various stages of this product and the public perception of it. Semina Aeternitatis is a bioart piece or non/living artwork using Margherita's concept, where I use a technique that has already been used in bioart, namely creating a plasmid that contains, a plasmid is a circular strand of DNA that is used by bacteria. You find it in bacteria. You can synthesize a plasmid with a DNA string that you desire. You order it, you receive it from a company. And then through a special process that opens the pore of the bacterial bodies, you let this tiny circular strand of DNA enter the bacterial body. This is the basic for pharma industry. This process is the basis of many reactions in the biolab. So what I did, I created this plasmid that contains the transcription from text to DNA through a code, through a code translation of the text of a memory of a woman. She gifted me with a very precious memory of her childhood. It was a learning moment from where she had a very close encounter with a horse. The project meant to be, when I initiated it, I was reflecting on transience, permanence, ephemeral, data storage, memory, and I was gifted with this incredible story where she had to trust the horse, and the horse knew the way home, and she had to trust it. It was a huge animal. She was only a 5-year-old girl. So I created a biofilm. A biofilm is a particular material produced by bacteria. It's extruded from pores on the membrane that is probably made by bacteria to protect the colonies. And there are certain bacteria that produce a sheer amount of this material. So I first worked with Escherichia coli, sorry, that's my Italian kicking in. So I first worked with Escherichia coli, a first bacterial strain that is used as a standard, as a model organism in biolabs. And then from this Escherichia coli bacteria, I worked with another kind of the Acetobacter family. And these bacteria produce biocellulose. So I obtained a large amount of cellulose from this bacteria that had this plasmid with the memory recollection in the bodies, and mounted it in an installation. Here you see a detail with a sculpture made of a horse skull and the cellulose. So the work then plays with the hardness of the skull, the whiteness, the surfaces and volumes, and this licky and fleshy materiality of by microbial cellulose. This is the petri dish where I could observe that these bacteria I asked and I forced to receive this plasmin actually received it. The small circles that you see indicate the colonies that receive the plasmid. And this is the exhibition view. On the right hand, you see the sculpture with the skull in a protected environment. And on the left side, you see the research table that shows the messiness of the research process and pictures and notes and recollections. The artwork was exhibited after sterilization because what was created was a GMO, a genetically modified organism. And in Europe, those organisms cannot leave the lab unless you have very special permissions, which are very cumbersome to obtain. So probably beyond the capacity of a single artwork or of an exhibition. So in this case, the non-living was happening inside the space of the biolab. It extended and it linked and reached the encounter with the woman who gifted me with this memory from her childhood, because this brought in different temporalities that exceeded the space of the artwork. It exceeded the space of the work in the biolab. It exceeded the lifespan of bacteria. But then I had to kill the artwork because it was not allowed to leave the lab. Eingeweide is a performance I did in collaboration with another artist who works mainly with sound and machines and bodies, Marco Donnarumma. In that case, we were imagining the coalescence of unstable bodies of different kinds of more than humankind, because there are the two bodies of the human performance. Then there is a special robotic prosthesis that he created in collaboration with a research center in Berlin and a designer. The prosthesis had an artificial intelligent algorithm embedded in it. And as you can see in this picture, the prosthesis that you see robotic covers the face. And this was meant to destabilize the standing position of the performance. In the same way, what I'm wearing, you can see a bit of it behind my ear. It's a mask made of microbial cellulose. In this case, of course, it was not genetically modified. I worked with the Acetobacter in my studio and created large sheets. So I had 1 meter of this mask that holding on my head. And in this way, both bodies were unstable. The access to making them unstable was refusing to use the standing position and refusing to have a face. Both faces are erased, and both faces become a sensorial organ. The prosthesis through the sensorimotor and the artificial intelligence algorithm. Whereas in the case of the mask that I'm using the mask to see where the light comes, because I cannot see anything. But I use the light to orient myself on stage and slide with the help of this leaky materiality. Here you see a performance view in Właśnie, at the Art Center Właśnie in Gdańsk, Poland. And you see that on the stage there are these fake, huge animal skins hanging. but you also see that what we're doing is only flow work. We never stand, we only slide, crawl, and roll. What the white dots you see are coarse salt grains that initially are very tidy and then slowly cover the whole surface. So the body crawl on the floor, use their prosthesis and their erase face as ways to orient themselves on the stage, and at the same time their capacity, their ability to move is reduced both by the prosthesis themselves as well as the environment that slowly becomes less comfortable and more hostile because of the grains on the floor. The next and last work we'll talk about is a series that I realized in through different collaboration. Its title is Wounds, and it started as a reflection of about the fact of having a female body that is currently taking hormonal contraceptions. I started asking myself, what does this contraception to my body? How does it work exactly? How comes I have the access to it? What about my situatedness? But what about my situatedness not only as a social being, not only in society? What does it mean to take hormonal contraceptives also from an environmental perspective? How can I think this beyond my being a female body? And so the first chapter of the series is featured glassware with the bacterial colonies that grow in an environment that is polluted or contaminated by a urine extract that contains hormone metabolites. However, urine excretes a very small amount of hormones, so it's hard to say that female bodies taking contraceptives to pollute the environment. However, modern human bodies have been entangled in the story of hormones in a variety of ways. Just to mention the first pregnancy test that used Xenopus levis frogs, and then from this test, the frog became another standard another model organism in labs, or Premarin, that is a very common drug for menopausing bodies, initially was produced by extracting the hormone from the urine of pregnant mares, hence the name Premarin. So this exploration of what other bodies may react to the same molecule that I take as a self-determination. So I take it as a privilege. I take it because I can, and I can because of many others before me fought and researched and made social battles for that access. And we know it's not the same access everywhere. But this inquiry made me encounter slugs, terrestrial slugs, that are mostly considered another animal, perhaps disgusting. It's considered a pest. It's considered an invader, the Spanish slug. There is in the audience an artist who had made an excellent work on the Spanish slug. So there is previous research suggesting that slugs react to mammalian sex hormones. And whereas more recent research claim that science is officially unresolved about this. So there is a gray area. It means that there are no definitive answers. So to to deal with this uncertainty, to deal with this complexity, I created an installation which you now see in the picture on the left-hand side. It's an extra bodily organ that also records this other extra bodily organ. And in this, I made a DIY cell incubator that combines slug cells, slug egg cells. Here in this picture, you see a slug egg under microscope, and epithelial cells that I extracted from my vagina. Of course, combining gastropod cells and human cells require a certain degree of negotiation because they have two different, they come from two very different organisms. However, you can negotiate and accommodate both cell types. For instance, reducing the temperature, combining or reducing certain nutrients. And the work then manifested also in a performance for camera, from which 6 pictures resulted. Here you see 3 pictures from the series. You can also see that I like hanging stuff somehow. Very often in my work, things are hanging in impossible ways because artistically speaking, this is my reminder for the time. Okay. I think it brings me a sense of wonder having an exhibit that in the exhibition space is not placed on a pedestal, but this is to nurture my sense of wonder as an artist, as an eternal kid. So I would like to thank you for listening. And I would like to dedicate this presentation to Limulus polyphemus, which is an animal, it's an ancient animal that is particularly important and invisibly present in an invisible manner and in a non-living way in these times, because from their blood, there's a particular bioreagent used to test biomedical devices or biomedical materials for contamination. So it's also usually widely used in research for vaccination. We are all waiting for a vaccine. So we should remember always that these kind of entanglements are more present than we think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margherita. Biggest
Thank
applause.
you so much. It is the horseshoe crab, right?
Yes.
And the blue blood from the horseshoe crab that is so useful. Thank you so much, Margherita. Marietta,
thank you.
We have actually now some time for
burning questions.
Burning questions.
7
indeed.
minutes. Use your opportunity.
Indeed.
Yes, so thank you so much. I mean, so yes, I mean, if anyone, I asked Cecilia to chair, now I'm kind of, but yes, I mean, if anyone has any, comments, questions for clarification, or, whatever other questions that, cannot wait for the discussion, but really have to be posed here and now. I mean, we have quite some time, 6 minutes to chat with Margherita, so please use this chance. And you can type the question there, or just, like raise your hand. We'll try to do our best with Cecilia to make sure to, I mean, if we are 2, I mean, we shouldn't miss actually like any, raised hands or anything like that.
Oh, we have a question here.
Yeah.
From the artist Tiny Domingos. And perhaps you would like to raise the question and unmute yourself and ask it yourself.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Yes, I mean, I understood that there is the installation and then the creation, the combination of cells from your body, from the body of the artist, and from a non-human organism I forgot. And then the question is, this combination, what happens to it? So this is a living matter, and it's used, I understand, in the installation. And afterwards, what happens? There was this negotiation so that the combination is possible. And then afterwards, what is the future of this combination?
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. To answer it, I would like to go back for a moment to the slideshow. 1 second. Yeah. Because so in the installation, in this hanging extra bodily organ, there is a DIY bioreactor and DIY incubator. The incubator is a machine that keeps certain parameters. In my case, I worked on temperature. Incubator that you find in a biolab, for instance, has also either spinning or the special sensors that monitor the acidity of the environment according to the kind of culture you're doing. My version was a DIY one. I built it myself. So of course it's dysfunctional with respect to an incubator that you find in a biolab. But that was not the point, because I wanted to understand how to make it. And this is the hacking attitude that Cecilia mentioned in the introduction. What happens to the materials that is inside? So I made a small batch of cells that is contained glassware. I took glassware for scientific glassware, distorted it and made it as to host the cell culture. The cells that are exhibited afterward, they will inevitably or die or get contaminated, because you take this highly vulnerable material, non-living material that is taken from bodies, then set in the biolab, you bring it to the exhibition space where you don't have the same level of control. So it will manifest another way of being non-living. Either you discard it, you kill it, you preserve it, but it doesn't go back to the lab because you would bring back contaminants. However, in this case, in the case of this artwork, something happened related to the pandemic, because this artwork was finalized in the fall 2019, after a few months when I was supposed to start working again in the lab to make other batches of cells. The pandemic hit. We know what followed, and I was not able to go, but for a variety of converging factors, I was not able to go back to the lab to work. So I have no cells left, and I'm hoping to manage to it in the summer. So I can speak only from this experience of the picture that you saw in the exhibition, because from there, from that moment, this non-living art piece became a silent art piece in sense of the exhibited piece. I gave a lot of lectures, I exhibited other chapters from the series, but the cells to which I dedicated so much effort, money, and time manifested differently. But again, if you take the complexity of the non/living, then it's just another position in the complex.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Margherita. I would like to thank you again warmly from all of us. You see a lot of happy words in the chat. And we also have 2 questions actually in the chat, which I would like us to return to because they are quite extensive questions. So we have one question that you can ponder in the meantime on the role of collaborating with scientists, and one question on the impact of all this working with bioart in the post-human condition. But we return to those questions, and I would like to give the floor to our next presenter, Marietta Radomska.
Thank you so much. And I mean, it's just amazing, you know, to take floor after Margherita's wonderful talk. Okay, so I will also share my screen in a maybe nicer, okay, full. I hope you can see the full screen, right? Okay, so I mean, you know, the title of the paper is Ecologies of the Non-Living, a Queer Feminist Biophilosophical Perspective. I will be partly reading, partly talking, hopefully not, you know, not too extensive in time, and hopefully I will kind of register the time. But what I wanted to say perhaps, you know, at the very start is that this will be a rather more theoretical than, of course, practice-oriented talk as well. And I mean, also because, you know, my kind of entry point is rather as a kind of theorist or philosopher thinking with art or conversing with art. So I'm not coming as a practitioner, or I'm coming as a practitioner, but if you think about theory as practice, but that's another sort of, you know, opening to another sort of avenue of discussion. Right. So, yes, I mean, you know, so I would like to take us in the direction of concepts, imaginaries, you know, structures of thinking to kind of begin with. And of course, you know, one of the kind of, you know, starting points for the search for new concepts, articulations, you know, and narratives, which are very important, you know, as I think that you could sense already from Margherita's paper, that there are those different narratives about, you know, biomatter and living in the context of science and in the context of art. You know, it's also kind of looking to reflect upon those aspects or matters. It is important to also look, you know, at questions of both onto epistemologies, but also at questions of ethics. You know, questions of matters and understandings that shape, you know, what both life and death are and what they mean, right? So, I mean, there is also a very kind of, I think, you know, a lot of underlying themes with the kind of sort of, you know, inquiring about both conceptual frameworks for talking about life and the living and talking about death. And there are also kind of, I think, you know, very reasonable grounds for this, because I think that, you know, both our talks are also somehow grounded in the context where we discuss questions related to, you know, various forms of crisis, especially kind of environmental crisis or environmental disruption, to kind of actually quote Margherita here on that. And the, you know, the kind of questions of livability, non-livability. So let us, you know, kind of have this sort of, you know, question at the back of our heads. And of course, I mean, in this talk, drawing on, you know, process, queer and feminist philosophical perspectives, but also, you know, on several select examples of contemporary bio and media artworks, I will offer a queer feminist biophilosophy as an approach or as a methodology that may allow us to better comprehend the complexity, vibrancy, and materiality of the non/living. And, you know, where, of course, the non/living is always already understood as ecologies of non/living matters. And I will also try to look at, you know, how this sort of calls for both ontological and ethical reflection. So thinking about queer feminist biophilosophy, The binary juxtaposition between life and death, or living and non-living, but also human and non-human, brings us back to the very foundations and philosophical contours of the concept of life and its counterpart, death, which in fact can be traced back to the very beginnings of Western philosophy. And, it suffices to think about the Pythagorean table of opposites, and, later this whole thing, like theme going on, through Plato and Aristotle, and finally modern philosophers like Descartes and, various opposite categories. So, as philosopher Eugene Thacker argues, we may distinguish two styles or ways of going about life in Western philosophy. First is this kind of mentioned path, so Plato, Aristotle, Kant, where you have, where life is sort of, thought through either, its essence or so-called principle, or boundaries of articulation. So the kind of, categories that are defining and delimiting, for instance, distinguishing life from non-life. But also, there's a second onto-epistemological path framed as biophilosophy, which does not look for essences or binary classifications, but instead focuses on a critical, creative, and rigorous practice of asking, what relations are precluded in such and such a division, in such and such a classification, unquote. So in other words, biophilosophy is an investigation of life that pays attention to what transforms life instead of a twofold question of the basic principle and the boundaries of articulation. An investigation that looks at life as a multiplicity, that traverses binaries, avoids anthropomorphization, and pays attention to the issues of relations, their dynamics, and mechanisms of exclusion. So consequently, biophilosophy concentrates not only on ontology, so the question what life is, but also on ethics, and by that I mean, what relations is life embedded in, what gets excluded, very important, and what values are being ascribed in these processes. So you can see that this sort of framework is obviously, I mean, those of you who are kind of maybe more sort of like philosophy nerdy, I mean, you can see that there is this theme of, process philosophy is coming through, right? But of course, such a mode of engagement with both life and death can be found most importantly in the work of queer feminist philosophers. For instance, Claire Colebrook's Queer Passive Vitalism, Patricia McCormack's A Human Ethics, Erin Edwards' Conceptualization of the Corpse, Sarah Enser's Terminality, or of course also Rosie Braidotti's Zoe, are some that we could name here. So there, in their work, life is often conceptualized as a material force and intensity, a form of dynamism, inventiveness, creativity, but also, importantly, a potential for distraction and idleness that extend beyond the organic and directly tackle the issue of death. So it is in these thinkers' grounding in, in new materialist and queer feminist traditions of theorizing that allows them to approach life by focusing on its multiplicities and uncontainable character. So queer feminist biophilosophy addresses life as well as its counterpart, death, in both ontological and ethical terms, not by taking a certain image of life, to use the concept by Gilles Deleuze, and values attributed to that image of life as a point of departure, but instead by focusing on that which transforms life. So those multiplicitous differences, processes and materialities that carry a potential for generation as much as for self-destruction. And I think that some of the themes were really coming through Margherita's work just a moment ago. So biophilosophy sees the processes of living and dying and growth and decay not as binary oppositions, but as complex, interweaving and entangled phenomena. It entails focusing on the complexity of relationalities, intra and interactions, to use Bioart's concepts, and connections and disconnections, instead of individual forms of life and the manners in which they may be categorized. So against the backdrop of the contemporary ecological crisis, a queer feminist biophilosophical ethical approach means not only responsibility for the protection or preservation of life, but also, quote, staying with the trouble, unquote, of terminality, which Sarah Enser, who is a literary scholar working with queer eco-criticism, describes not only as a state and intimate belonging, but also as a practice and a horizon. In other words, the notion of terminality suggests a lifelong and shared condition characterized by the potential for relations, nonlinear temporality, and an ongoing responsibility for and accountability towards the harmed, the ill, the perishing, and the dead, environments, ecosystems, organisms, and landscapes. So thinking through the lens of terminality is this but one example, of course, of kind of queer feminist biophilosophical approach that does not depart from giving images of life and death, but instead from a multiplicity of relations, forces, and materialities. So that which transforms and traverses life, encompassing the potentials for both growth, development, and decomposition, decay. And for a moment here, before I kind of go on with the reading, I would like to stop to just look at the work of Terike Happoja, who is a fantastic Finnish artist working across various forms of media. But I would like to look at the work called Community from 2007, where, and I mean, you can of course read the quote from Terike's writing about the work. So you also see the questions around vulnerability and disappearance coming through. But what I wanted to say is that basically the work was done in such a way that dying or rather dead animal bodies right after the moment of death were recorded with special thermosensitive camera. So the recordings basically show how the body cools down. And the installation was made in such a way that those projections were, on circular screens of, different sizes, kind of adjusted to the, also the size of the animal body. And each projection, of course, lasted a couple of hours until, the body cooled down completely and sort of disappeared, as you see the process on the, bottom left of the screen, like an example of one of those circular screens. And, one of the kind of messages behind, also the title was to try to create a space where, this kind of meditative space where also the, the visitors or the viewers could sort of, contemplate the processes of, kind of death and the kind of actually processuality of death and the sort of relation to those bodies in a very intimate way. So I mean, there are different things that one could say about this work, but actually this kind of really meditation, taking seriously the processuality of dying, and actually I would still argue an attempt to sort of de-exceptionalize the human in that sense. I think it's really interesting. So yes, but to continue, get back to my biophilosophical argument. Consequently, of course, biophilosophy also challenges the Western cultural imaginaries that draw thick dividing lines between bodies, between the human and non-human, organic and inorganic, and life and death. Employing a biophilosophical lens enables one to look closer at life, death, not as fixed opposition, but instead attend to the phenomena and process, and actually processes in a kind of plural sense in an ecological manner, or one could even kind of go in the direction of Guattari's ecosophical manner, as non/living matters, right? So where, of course, the slash in the inscription points to the processual entanglement and relationality between what one may conventionally deem as living and non-living in a conventional sense, or life and death. So the concept of the non-living, I mean non/living, stems from a transdisciplinary theoretical and practical engagement with bioart, bioscience, and philosophical approaches to life. The non/living reframes what is conventionally referred to as life in order to problematize the materiality, processuality, vibrancy, dynamics, and ambiguity of the relationship between the living and non-living, growth and decay, and ultimately life and death. So firstly, the non/living addresses the issue of locating the constitutive characteristics of life, that is, what counts as life and how we can account for life forms that do not fulfill the 4 basic criteria of the living, emphasized by bioscience. So, I mean, those criteria, of course, I mean, as you may recall, is that, I mean, it is the requirement that, you know, the entity has a body, it metabolizes, reproduces, and is capable of movement. But I mean, you know, still there are those entities that, you know, despite that, cannot be classified as non-living in a conventional sense. And of course, some of, you know, such iconic examples are the heroes of today, so viruses, viroids, and prions, but also synthetic protocells. So, you know, like, of course, I mean, with regard to viruses, obviously, I mean, you know that the virus, in order to sort of replicate, it needs a host cell. But also, secondly, the non/living attends to the complexity of the relationship between living and dying, and they're kind of like material and temporal entanglement. These are the processes where material forces unfold, intertwine, and express themselves in what we evaluate as life and death. By challenging binary categorizations and focusing on relationalities, the non/living problematizes the often taken for granted notions of life and death. And of course, I mean, this entanglement comes to the fore very much in bioart, where growth and decay often collapse into one another in a limited space of a petri dish or an incubator, and when biomatter is sustained alive through technology guaranteeing optimal conditions, sterile environment, temperature, nurture, among others. And I think that, you know, here I have a couple of slides that kind of go away from my story in the written paper, but I will try to, you know, kind of connect that. So I would like to actually go back to a very iconic example, which I think like anyone who hears bioart probably knows the project, like the artists behind the project. So I'm talking here about the Tissue Culture and Art Project, which is an artistic duo based in Australia, who are actually famous for, you know, creating kind of, as they call them, semi-living sculptures made of bioengineered animal tissues seeded on biopolymer scaffoldings of certain shapes. And this is like one of the examples, pig wings. And, you know, what is, I think, really interesting in the context of their work is precisely that technologies both sustain and discipline organic matter. And here are some examples of the works, which I will talk in a moment a little bit more. So what is really interesting with the Tissue Culture and Art Project, they really, you know, very much focus or prioritize in their work, you know, questions related to consumption, you know, of the world we live in. So, you know, things like, for instance, you know, clothes or leather, you know, food we eat, and other aspects come to the kind of very, very center of, you know, what they work on. And one of the really interesting projects or series was the project called Victimless Utopia, or actually a series of projects that consisted of the, you know, of the work called Victimless Leather, the work Disembodied Cuisine, and DIY The Victimizer Kit. Each of them was, you know, kind of recreated a couple of times. So basically, Victimless Leather was this like tiny, you know, biopolymer scaffolding in the shape of a jacket, and, you know, they were growing basically, you know, mammal cells on it. So that's why, you know, they're kind of playing with the idea of growing leather in a lab. Disembodied Cuisine was basically creation of, you know, cruelty-free meat. So basically they took biopsy, from frogs and seeded again on scaffoldings and, then kind of grew stakes. Which is interesting because, I mean, this concept, was taken up by biotechnologists and, kind of like engineers. And then, I think that probably everyone heard here about like lab-grown burgers from Maastricht and, Mark Post, if I remember correctly, the name of the scientist working with that. So that's, that's something that actually science or design is actually very much working with. So, but it's interesting that, the whole kind of playful engagement in a kind of critical manner, not the kind of naive manner, actually started, and very ironic manner, started with the art. And obviously, the questions are very much around, animal consumption, commodification and exploitation. So they ask, okay, if we move that everything to the lab, do we actually create a new class of beings to be exploited? But I mean, obviously, I mean, as critical artists, they don't give the answers. They really pose very interesting, ironic and problematic questions. But I mean, what also comes with the title, Victimless Utopia, I mean, it also sort of gestures in the direction that, the kind of idea of victimless utopia is quite naive, because living in the world is, never victimless. And I think that the most important thing here, probably that I forgot to mention, and that should be the starting point, is that growing all those mammal tissues, especially mammal, but also some other animal tissues, requires the use of fetal bovine serum, as one of the kind of nutrients and basically medium to grow those tissues. And I mean, as the name, indicates, it's basically a byproduct from a slaughterhouse sort of, I mean, like it's actually extracted from, cow fetuses that are a kind of byproduct from a slaughterhouse. So everything, nothing is wasted. I mean, I'm sorry, this is like also my ironic joke. But I mean, what they point towards is that even if we create this like lab-grown meat, in fact, there is always some victim behind it, even if we hide it very, very much. And I think that that's an interesting point to keep in mind, especially if we think about our ethical ways of being in the world. Okay, so here you can see a little bit, more of both the jacket and, the size of the jacket, but also the size of the, huge stakes. And, what is really interesting, and I think what is really kind of, one of the starting points for all my argument about uncontainability and, the kind of also excess with regard to the non-living and kind of, thinking about life, is that, it's very hard and sometimes impossible to really discipline those living matter. So, there are examples here from the, exhibitions where actually the tissue culture basically got infected by fungi, or, overgrew the space of the container. And then there was, of course, the headline in New York Times Museum kills a live exhibit. So, the kind of questions of killing are always present there, with actually exhibiting that kind of, works, because I mean, they are usually not to be kept forever. And I think that actually Carolina, who is present here, I mean, her seminar actually pointed extremely much towards those kind of questions. So I mean, it's lovely to have that, continue the conversation. Okay, but I should kind of move on, although, I could talk a lot about that. Apart from that bioartistic side, of course, the non/living is also at the very center of the corpse. The dead body of a human or a non-human individual is a lively site where elements of the microbiome of the body, along with other organisms, flourish and continue to overtake the volume of the corpse. It is this liveliness of decomposition that leads to the perception of the dead body as abject, to link back to Margherita, repulsive, and simultaneously too alive and too dead. The materiality of the corpse lingers in the liminality, and now I see I'm exceeding the time, where growth and decay are entangled with one another in viscerally visible ways. So recognizing the non/living character of the corpse demands revisiting and nuancing our approaches to the dead body beyond the double focus on either abjectness or sacredness, which, of course, the latter is really reserved for human corpse exclusively. So an entanglement of the living and non-living, organic and inorganic matter, and life and death calls for an ontology that could account for its own flat, non-hierarchical character on the one hand, and its multiplicity of processual differences on the other. While a non-hierarchical character of ontology is desirable, it cannot be accompanied by flat ethics or ethical politics, as feminist scholars emphasize. The non/living as an ontology takes multiplicities of processual differences, seriously by drawing on the life-death enmeshment theorized by Gilles Deleuze as radical immanence. And of course, calling immanence radical means that it's not, contained within anything else but itself. So we have this whole sort of framework, a very Spinozian framework that tries to point that, there is no external force or transcendent agent sort of like arranging things, but rather that we have to do with like one substance equated with life that is radically immanent and a non/living, and expresses itself in a multiplicity of relationalities, neither immutable nor rigid, but unfolding through modulations and affects. And of course, the Spinozian and Deleuzian conceptualizations, are again present in feminist philosophers' work. So, for instance, Claire Colebrook's reading of Passive Vitalism, Patricia McCormack's theorization of ahuman ethics, defined as, quote, indescribable relations and connectivities, seeking in secret and silence and invisibility and never arriving at the thought. They are instigated by the life we must immanently live in order to respect the death that we perpetrate, unquote. That was a kind of fast quoting. I think that I started to speed up. So, while grounded in and indebted to this queer feminist biophilosophical tradition, the concept of the non/living brings bioartistic and bioscientific practices and discourses as key partners in dialogue and catalysts for philosophical understandings. And I think that, I don't think that I have time really to talk about this. This is, the work of Svenja Kratz and The Absence of Alice. I think that I recently, kind of published something on that. So I think that you can read more. I will just, speed up and head towards the end. But I think that, her amazing kind of universe or wonderland, on the one hand, really meditating on the, on the death of a person who, or a donor, anonymous donor, from whom the kind of bone cancer cell line was extracted, actually takes this anonymous human death into the sort of universe of human and non-human or more than human, agents, and perhaps deaths and lives that are very much entangled. And I think that this whole series of works, The Absence of Alice, really creates a kind of, again, space for meditation and thinking about more than human, also mourning, not only death and dying. And like to, bring us to the conclusion, I'm doing this sort of, ending up with environmental humanities. The biophilosophical perspective, built on process philosophies, feminist and queer materialist theorizing, but also resonant with non-Western cosmologies and philosophies like, Australian, indigenous Australian cosmologies that are actually discussed by Deborah Bird-Rose, allows one to attend to complexities of relationalities between living and non-living and human and non-human on both micro and macro scales, so crucial for understanding, for instance, the materiality and vibrancy of the dead body, the materiality of bioartworks, or, for instance, ecologies of marine dead zones like the one in the Baltic Sea. So such entangled, undecidable, one might say, queered and queering depiction of life-death ontology where human and life as we know it are no longer the decisive prism also opens up an ethical reflection. What relations to death, dying and mourning can emerge when the starting point is more complex and different. And I exceeded the time terribly. I mean, I'm so sorry about that. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen and move here.
Please join me, everybody, in a warm applause for Marietta, in whatever way you want to express it, in the chat or, you know, with your body.
Thank you so much. But yeah, I mean, I'm sorry about, like, you know, lack of sense of time.
We lost track of time too, Marietta, because it was really
that's
interesting.
But yeah, I mean, how should we do it? I mean, is there any kind of burning question, or should we take, you know, a break and do an audiobook? I'm sorry, I mean, I cannot help like seeing the chat. But I mean, is there any kind of burning question, or should we take you know, a little break and like run like crazy with all the kind of maybe joint questions? Is there any preference? Are you tired? So if there are burning questions, then this is your chance. Otherwise, we do a 5-minute leg stretcher and we reconvene.
I think I would suggest so that you keep your questions, you mull on them for a little bit, and you come back after your little comfort break. And then we will have more of an open discussion, everybody, on what this means and what does this do for us.
Right.
Thank you so much, Marietta. Thank you so much, Margherita, for your presentations. Now we go for a 5-minute comfort break, and we see each other back here in 5 minutes, which in according to my mobile phone clock means 14:37.
Perfect. Excellent.
So 14:37, everybody, we'll be back. Welcome back, you timely ones. I'm desperately trying to get a hold of my daughter, but so hence I was on the phone. But let's continue these exciting discussions. Margherita, did you have any chance to think of the great questions that you got in the chat? And the first one was about collaborating and working with scientists.
Yes, I did have time, although I must say I was very much captivated by Marietta's presentation. Great, it was fantastic. Thank you so much. And regarding the collaboration with the scientists, there are various ways of collaborating with scientists. There is no one standard that works in all the situations, because to give an example, for my PhD, I've been doing research at the Biophilia Laboratory, which is a biolab that is explicitly set for artistic practice. And so it conjures and invites both practitioners from the arts and humanities and sciences working on towards this interest. This is also where I met Cecilia and Marietta for the first time a few years ago. Then the collaboration can start or be, let's say, instigated by some shared research interest. For instance, as in the case with the human computer scientist and bioscientist I worked for Semina Aeternitatis, Professor Mirella Alistar. We know each other from the citizen science bioarcing scene in Berlin, and then we collaborated for the project. Although we had the support of a research facility, a research institute, institutes. Oh, now my poor mind sometimes loses pieces. So I look up the name. I don't want to to say the name wrong, but we were supported by a research facility which we addressed explicitly for this specific collaboration. Or you can work as an artist in residence for a certain time in a scientific research facility. So there are different ways, and they combine both institutional policies, desires, as well as personal contact and communication. So each one is set through a different combination of these three elements: funding, opportunities, scientists in being interested in the artist's mind, scientists were interested in more funding opportunities, and so on. However, working as an artist in a biolab, you learn very quickly, but you have to learn a lot, because there are very strict protocols that one should follow. There are group dynamics you should respect, or at least learn how to navigate that. There are hierarchies that are different from the ones in the humanities or the ones in the arts. So in my case, they all started from this artistic intuition, and then I did a long time research looking for the right partners to develop the artworks fully. And this research went through all the steps that I mentioned in different combinations. If, Manuela, if this answer leaves something unresolved, please let me know.
Thank you so much, Margherita. Perhaps the audience would like to, who you addressed, would like to respond immediately. If not, we actually have also the question raised by the audience in the chat on what does this do for the post-human condition? That's a big one, right?
I think it poses more questions. But there's a multiplicity of directions it takes, and this multiplicity is very much consistent to the post-human condition, at least in my understanding of it. There is on one hand the awareness that your situatedness as a human being does mark your understanding and your knowing of the world. So you can, what you can do is to debunk it, explode it, remix it, but it's hard to forget, because it's through this sensorium that you understand, but you can learn to think differently with this sensorium. On the other hand, it also makes it very visible, very, well, not only visible, but it makes it very clear that humans are random guests on this planet and on this universe. So it constantly challenges what you are doing, because every time you choose to work with a material, for instance, in art, I don't know, if you're a sculptor, you buy foam, you buy latex, you buy acrystyle, you buy stones, or you make them, but they are materials. Whereas through the bioart practice, at least from a posthumanist or from a feminist perspective, you challenge, you interrogate the materials you use. So in the womb's installation of the chapter W.02, I have human cells that I took from my body, slug cells I took from wild slug eggs. I have silicon, I have some electricity, very basic, but all these do something to me. Each one of these materials, I remember one of the first feedbacks I had on the work by a very experienced artist in the field of bioart. She said, "Oh, that's a lot of silicon. You know, you would never say this to a sculpture." And it's true at the same time. So there is there is an ongoing, non-stopping, because it can't be stopped. There is always this uncontainability that Marietta talks about. There is need to transgress the categories we have been socialized, educated with, that pops up at every step. This is also because I'm sure Carolina understands it very well. We're working as artists and researchers, so it's not only about making an artwork that looks nice and can be presented in an exhibition, hopefully successfully, but it's also this ongoing questioning, ongoing asking yourself. And this is what it does to the post-human condition. So it expands it, multiplies it, fragments it, it explodes it, which is something I see absolutely as a fertile process. So I reclaim this explosion.
Great.
Brilliant. Thank you. And
that,
Marietta, I know you want to have a stab
but
at this
also
as well.
I was interpolated to.
Yeah.
I'm joking. So no, I mean, but I'm actually not joking. Right. No, I think that, you know, I could kind of, you know, of course, subscribe to a lot of what Margherita was saying. So maybe, you know, just taking it a step back. I mean, if we think about human, post-human a bit, you know, in a kind of analogous way as we think about humanities and post-humanities. So of course, I mean, you know, I have a soft spot for Lyotard and, you know, rewriting in humans. So basically, you know, the critical move of post-humanities is also a move of sort of rewriting, revising, rethinking the humanities that has been, you know, very much starting from the human, what a human is, you know, and what it means, and so on and so forth, or what he means. So actually, you know, if we think about then post-human condition, of course, then it is also a kind of, you know, question of, or kind of questioning it or asking about it means also questioning the sort of, you know, a certain revisiting of what a human is, what a human condition is. And I think that, you know, what really happens with bioart, or this kind of, you know, rethinking of what life is that actually, philosophically speaking, or, you know, in kind of more conventional approaches, or, you know, major ways of thinking or imagining, you know, thinking about life in both Western traditions of philosophy, but also, I would say, you know, cultural imaginaries that usually accompany them and usually are, you know, not always, we are not necessarily always kind of conscious or aware of, you know, what kind of imaginaries are driving our, you know, our choices, our ways of, you know, acting and thinking, and so on and so forth. Actually, I think, you know, bioart, by bringing the biomatter to the fore, and by actually creating situations where, you know, suddenly it appears that these biomaterials have some sort of agentiality of their own. They are sort of, you know, obviously exposed to the agency of the artist, who, you know, kind of tries to control and manage like scientists do. But then, you know, that biomatter sometimes, you know, kind of leaks here and there. Basically, you know, kind of really undermines the, you know, the kind of mindset of exceptionalism of human as an agent, as a kind of, primary agent, primary rational being. I think that Bioart also, with different discourses surrounding it, draws attention to things like, the microbiome, for instance, that, how much we are driven by, our gut bacteria. So, maybe our moods or our life choices are somehow, controlled or affected at least by by agents, or actants, whatever what kind of register you prefer to go for, that are not necessarily human. So I think that, what is really important here is that, it really sort of brings to the fore the questions of, of life. Maybe life is not necessarily what we imagine life to be, or maybe life is not the life as we know it, to maybe kind of, paraphrase both Myra Hurd and oh God, I mean, I forgot the person who spoke about endosymbiosis, Margulis. So, maybe actually life is not as we know it, and maybe also, in that sense, the condition of the human condition is not really, as we kind of assumed it to be, as some kind of, agent, rational being. But that doesn't, of course, mean that we evade responsibility for the things that we do. So I think that it really draws attention to the complexity. So if we think about, how bioart kind of, and that kind of research of, thinking about life, death, and kind of sort of questioning those both binaries and, categorizations, I think the focus on that really draws attention to the urgency of questioning human exceptionalism that is very much part of the, Western mindset and kind of cultural imaginary, but also sets of values, ethics, and so on and so forth. And I see that, I hope that this sort of answers, but I also see question from Nora, who is waiting, has been waiting
Nora
for a while.
has been waiting for a long time. Nora,
Apologies.
please.
Or, yes, unmute yourself, my dear.
I was very happy to listen to your responses, so no problem waiting at all. Thank you so much for these wonderful talks. It was great to hear both of your perspectives and how they joined together. And Margherita, especially to see your works, how they developed, because we exhibited an early version of Semina Aeternitatis in Norway a few years ago. And it was such a wonderful experience also to be able to share a memory within that work. And it's such a rich piece. And so to see how it's grown and where it's now at, it was just, yeah, so great. And I have one question for Margherita and one for the both of you. In my head, they're kind of interrelated, so I'll try to keep it as brief as possible and to keep my tongue straight. So I'll start with the one that's for the both of you, I think. I sympathize so much with this intention towards non-hierarchical relationality as a sort of basic element of how you theorize the non-living, Marietta. But in practice, this is so difficult, right? And we see this in bioart works, especially all the time. When you talk about the Tissue Culture and Art project, they point out how mammalian cells that they work with are not given consideration in everyday processes, that you would kill more cells brushing your teeth than what they do with these little sculptures. And in my head, this is related to your wombs piece, Margherita, because you have the slug egg cell and you have epithelial cells from your body. And I was thinking to myself, what would it be like if it was the other way around, if you chose to use your egg cells, would that be possible within the work? Would you be allowed to work with your egg cells? And what does this say about that relationality? Yeah, so I'd love for you both to reflect on this sort of interrelated matter.
Thank you so much. Exciting, very much exciting question. Margherita, do you want to go first or should I go first? Thank you, Nora. I've thought that this might, it's a question that is sort of like coming back. So it's an accompanying question. And I think a brilliant point, I mean, that you are bringing this up. Because of course, I mean, this is a kind of an attempt to theorize, of course, in ways that would seek to, undo the kind of hierarchies, particularly the sort of, human prioritization in whatever, in whatever sort of like area of life. So, I mean, we have to do really with the kind of, the entire, I would say, cultural mindset or cultural imaginary, and also accompanying that, different areas of life where actually, human is, of course, exceptionalized. But I think that what really is important, I think, in this theorizing, and particularly in the, what comes with the, I would say, feminist input into that. So feminist input, those different thinkers that I was trying to, draw on, but which perhaps, I mean, we are in a limited space and time, of course. So, I mean, it's not that you can go into detail very much, but I think what actually particularly comes, with the work, I mean, I think each of them. So, but even thinking about Claire Colebrook particularly, I think it is really important, the kind of question of, multiplicitous differences. So not necessarily this kind of binary juxtaposition between the human that is, leveled up and the non-human that is like some sort of undifferentiated ground lower. But that actually those differences, of course, matter in a sense that I wouldn't say that this biophilosophical framework tries to, redo the hierarchy in a different way, but rather problematize the hierarchies that are already there. And at the same time, be extremely, so in a kind of parallel way, we have this biophilosophical framework and of course the kind of bioart practice. And I think bioart practice precisely shows, as you yourself said, and like brought examples from the TCNA work, that actually, the idea of the kind of full horizontal plane of power relations is of course an illusion. And I think that the whole victimless utopia also points to that idea that it is an illusion. However, that doesn't mean that, that we should kind of probably arrive at the sort of, binary opposition of either, we have a kind of horizontal plane of a utopia, or we have the, the exceptionalized human and the rest of the living or non-living, kind of undifferentiated and probably lower in kind of ethical considerations. So I think that what actually, like from sort of my philosophical perspective or my philosophical proposition, what it aims to do is to really encourage to pay attention to those very kind of multiplicitous differences, and also what comes with that very sort of, power differentials at play. And kind of really, I think that, I have been very much brought in the kind of post-structuralism, one could maybe even say postmodern tradition, but I stick to post-structuralist. So very much kind of, idea of case by case basis of really thinking about, those, what actually matters in a given place and time. So I would say that, if my intervention is like, if I am to kind of like quickly say what my intervention tries to boil down to, it will be actually this sort of like much more of sensibility and kind of, paying attention to those multiplicitous differences, which do not mean automatically the completely horizontal plane, because of course, it's not that the biomatter in the lab can control what a scientist fully do. I mean, there are already like a certain, power differentials at place. Yes, but I think that, yeah, I mean, I should probably stop and give Margherita space because I mean, I talk too much, so I'm sorry, but I hope that it addresses somehow your question. And we, like if we want, we can stay a little bit longer for those who can. Margherita.
Yes, thank you, Marietta. You opened up the question and unpacked it very effectively, I must say. But this is what happens working with these kind of materials and with the research approach. You find yourself in a room full of Pandora jars, and the only thing you can do is open all of them. And power relations are not to be avoided. It's not possible to skim them because, again, you are as an artist in a biolab or in a biohacking lab. There are a bit different frameworks, or you're in your studio, that's a different framework. And this gives a different landscape of power relations. If you work with your body, or if you work with standard cell lines, there are different power relations. Standard cell lines are those lines that almost every biolab in the world uses, but they do entail a whole bunch of ethical problematics that relate to how they were harvested and how they've been used for many years. Also, Carolina has worked a lot on this already. They are not to be avoided. What can count, at least in my experience and at least from what has emerged in my research, is how you approach them. And in this sense, feminist situatedness comes is of great help. Sorry, lost myself in the words. You're right with your question, Nora, regarding wombs. What if I use my egg cells and slugs, equivalent of epithelial cells? This would mean that I undergo in vitro fertilization procedure for the part of it to harvest my cells, my egg cells, store them. What are the ethical aspects of this procedure? Would I be allowed? Can I technically do that? What kind of funding do I need to do? Because it's very expensive. Instead, if I scratch my vagina and then set it to culture, it's a different ethical and cost aspect. What would I be to kill living slugs to harvest the equivalent of epithelial cells? Can I scratch their skin? Would their skin survive? They don't have skin, they have a mantle, sorry. Would that survive in biolab conditions? And there was a moment where this question came in another form, because during the research I made a terrarium for slugs. It was a very nice one, I must say. It was very welcoming, at least in my understanding, that is limited, of course, with grass growing, water for humidity. And because I found on one of the first days of the residency, when I developed the work, I met leopard slug in a cafe, and I took it to the terrarium. It's the same leopard slug that is in the photographic series. I named it Branco. I liked the name Branco, so it became Branco. And I realized that naming something, naming Branco, naming Alice, naming an artwork, not naming the girl from which the HeLa cells were taken, which is one of the standard cell lines, is an act of power and love, perhaps, because I'm sure that the scientists who took these cells were in love with what they are doing and probably unaware, or they did not consider the ethical consequences of the heal cells, but seeing a cell line for the first time triggers a feeling that perhaps is similar to love. At the same time, naming an animal, naming an artwork is an act of love and power. And you are always embedded and entangled in this mess. You never go out from this. So what can help is probably understanding that nothing is there to remain. It always matters according to the context. It always matters in relation to the research question. It always matters how you credit animals, collaborators, the setting. There is nothing, probably presenting something as an absolute, or again in some kind of transcendental entity. This is risky in terms of power relations, whereas understanding that you are always somehow moving around in a complex that is never stable, you never have a fixed position. This, in my experience, gives a different understanding of these power relations and hierarchies. And I'm super happy to see you here. It's a big emotion to see you, Nora, because yes, this exhibition was particularly dear to me.
Likewise.
Mutual love and adoration going on in all directions here. This is wonderful. We have come to the end of this seminar, and unless there are, something that you absolutely have to take the opportunity to ventilate somehow, ask. It's okay.
Nora, I know that you had another question, but I mean, I don't know if you want to throw it in, or we should take it like on a, kind of outside of the seminar space basis. I mean, whatever you prefer. No?
Nora?
Oh, was that a question for me?
Yeah, because I mean,
Sorry.
you said that you had 2 questions. That's why I'm asking that if this is
Yes,
like,
no, I
something
think
that needs to be said.
I think we've run over time, and I
Okay.
see that it takes a while to discuss.
I'm sorry, we are not,
time.
we are excessive. We are also uncontainable. I'm sorry, this is like a stupid joke. But no, I think that then, thank you so much once again, because I mean, it inspired us to think together. But yes, I mean, so I think that, probably together with Cecilia, I'm sorry, I mean, I'm so used to chairing those sessions that I think I forgot about my role today. But I mean, I guess we would like to thank everyone, right? I mean, yeah, feel free to run.
Indeed. I think it's really important to thank you so much, Marietta. Thank you so much, Margherita, for your wonderful presentations and for your excellent answers to really delicate questions. And the questions were good too. So thank you so much, everybody. So it's just my big pleasure to say thank you to all of you who've been listening. Thank you to all of you who've been engaging, in your inner world or in the outer world of Zoom. And thank you again so much to the presenters. And perhaps you have a cup of tea or something next to you so we can just raise our glasses. And thank you again. And this is the start of the EBL, the Eco and Bioart Lab. Thank you all so much for attending.
And see you, of course, all after summer. at our joint seminars.
Yeah, thank you all. It's been so refreshing and such a great audience. Fantastic.
Wonderful. Thank you all. So I'm